I'm Jan Macvarish, and I work at the Centre for Parenting and Culture Studies at the University of Kent. I'm chairing the session. So welcome to Babies, Brains and BS, as I'm going to call it. I realised I'd come up with a title that actually I shouldn't really say, so my kids were delighted, but it does make it a little bit unworkable. So BS, bullshit, once, and we'll call it BS after this. The session was designed to have a discussion about a very particular phenomenon, and that is the use of the argument that neuroscience tells us what children need and what parents and carers need to do to raise fully functioning, happy children, and ultimately adults and a functioning society. In particular, this argument is made by those who make the case for early intervention in family life. So what started in the US back in the 90s, or probably earlier actually, as a 0 to 3 agenda of the early years, but has since become a 0 to 2 agenda, and increasingly has been used to make the case for interventions in pregnancy and even in preconception, the preconception period, to improve, it's argued, the quality of parenting that children receive. And it's argued, in case you're not familiar with this field of policy, it's argued that by paying attention to what neuroscience now tells us, we can better prepare children for the world, and we can improve the quality of the relationships between parents and children, and ultimately solve a whole range of social problems, which in your photocopy, I know you've got a black and white one, so you can't see this very well, but if you can see the two government reports, which are from the UK, the one on the left just simply shows two children's brains. One says normal underneath, and the other one says extreme neglect of a 3-year-old child, apparently. And on the right, that image has been used in a later report to argue that by paying attention to the brains of young children, we can solve social problems, which you won't be able to read, but on the gold bullion bars, which are on the right-hand side of the brains there, it says that we could reduce public spending by solving the problems of things like teenage pregnancy, criminal, antisocial behaviour, unemployment, mental health problems, all kinds of social problems, could be reduced and prevented if we pay attention to the child's brain in the early years. So I did this just so you've got an idea of what has been going on in the policy sphere. Can I just ask you if people can stick their hand up if they've seen that image, either on those reports or not? Okay, about a third of you. Okay, that's useful for us to know. And on the other side, you've also got some more indications of where this kind of thinking is now evident in the UK policy context. So if you're a parent, you may be familiar with other aspects of this type of way of thinking about raising children, such as state-provided baby massage classes. So anybody who's had a baby may well have been offered baby massage classes. You may not have thought of that as something that's to do with neuroscience, but actually the rationale behind it is that it will increase your attachment to your baby, that it will increase your level of attunement to your baby, and that the baby's brain will benefit from that kind of intensive attention that it will receive during the baby massage process. If you go beyond policy, you might be familiar with baby Mozart, baby Einstein, these kinds of products. Who's bought baby Einstein or baby... Come on, fess up. Okay, good. We'll ask you what you think of them later. So these are products which are claimed to create more intelligent, but actually now more emotionally intelligent babies. And you may also be familiar with the talk of stress, of cortisol, of critical periods, enriched environment, synaptic density, hardwiring. Again, we'll find out as the discussion proceeds the extent to which these kinds of concepts have managed to resonate with everyday ways of thinking in terms of the way we raise our children. So I've handpicked 3 speakers to help us discuss this trend from a number of directions. On my left is Val Gillies, and Val is a professor of social research and director of the Families and Social Capital Research Group at the Weeks Centre for Social and Policy Research at London South Bank University. She's researched and published in the area of family, social class and at-risk youth, producing a wide range of articles, chapters and books on parenting, social policy and homeschool relations. Most pertinent to this session, she's currently co-directing a Faraday Institute-funded project called Brain Science and Early Intervention, tracing the new biologisation of parenting and childcare with Rosalind Edwards from Southampton University. And I'm also involved in a project funded by the same scheme, which is interested in a very similar area, working with my colleagues at Kent. Val has spent the past year, I think, tracking down the advocates of neuroscience programmes, such as Camilla Batman-Gelly of Kids Company, which she might tell you about, or she may not. And she's also been researching the way in which brain science is being inserted into the work of midwives, health visitors and early years workers. And Val is going to speak first to talk about the British policy context of these ways of thinking. And then we have Sally Seitel, who's a psychiatrist and resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. She's also a lecturer at Yale University School of Medicine, and her work lies at the interface of medicine and culture. You may have seen Sally speak earlier this morning on the question of addiction. Sally's books include PCMD, How Political Correctness is Corrupting Medicine, One Nation Under Therapy, and When Altruism Isn't Enough, The Case for Compensating Kidney Donors. And her most recent book, which I can wave around and is available in the bookshops, is Brainwashed, The Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience, which tells us something of where Sally's coming from on the cover of the book, which is always useful when you're making choices. And Nancy McDermott is a writer and editor based in New York, and she's best known for her role within the Park Slope Parents online community, which is a parenting community offering support and information to parents. And while there, she was commended for her compassionate and cool-headed ability to counter hyper-parenting, which I'm sure was more than evident in Park Slope, a particularly middle-class area of Brooklyn, where she became known as the voice of reason. And she's a regular contributor to Spiked and a founding member of the New York Salon. She blogs at the Parenting Mystique. So I'm going to ask each of the speakers to speak briefly in turn to give us their thoughts to kick things off. You know the format. I'm going to try and give as much time as we can to the audience because I'm particularly interested in just how much awareness there is of this kind of way of thinking and what people's opinions are on this. And similarly, I'm very aware that we don't have scientists on the panel because we wanted to start the discussion a little bit further down the road, actually, to see where this kind of way of thinking, this scientism, perhaps, has taken us in policy terms. So Val's going to start, and then Sally's going to speak, and then we're going to go over to Nancy. So Val.
Well, last year, the Conservative MP, Andrea Leadsom, convened a conference on early years intervention called Too is Too Late. And the event was an absolute sellout. Over 500 delegates attended from local authorities, services and charities from up and down the country, and many more languished on the waiting list. The key focus of the event was infant brain development and the perceived consequences of poor early relationships. The popularity of this event and the stark message conveyed in its title reflects the rise of early intervention as a policy doctrine and the extent to which its authority is grounded in an appropriation of neuroscience. The idea that professionals should routinely intervene in the family lives of disadvantaged children meets little resistance these days, and in fact this policy direction is often regarded as demonstrating the more compassionate, progressive side of the current government. Politicians from every political party, social commentators, right from across the political spectrum, professionals, practitioners and children's charities have all rallied around the cause of early intervention. And this consensus, I think, is key to understanding why policy has taken the neuroscience route. A scientific lexicon places the doctrine of early intervention beyond question, transforming what once would have seemed objectionable into a benevolent, common-sense response to social problems and inequalities. Strip away the rhetoric, though, and you're left with a crude biologisation of children's development, naturalising and disguising deeply objectionable classed, gendered and racialised contentions. To put it in a nutshell, claims that the fragile infant brain is determined in the early years of life supports a political agenda that deflects responsibility for all social ills onto mothers. Neuroscience is a convenient and a potent vehicle of persuasion, and best of all, its rhetorical value can operate in virtual isolation from its real status and progress as a science. Policy pronouncements on early intervention bear no scrutiny. You don't have to be a neuroscientist to spot the blatant hijacking of the discipline to further a particular ideological agenda. Profound and quite startling claims grounded in a combination of dubious sources, conjecture and outright misrepresentation are cloaked in the authority of neuroscience to manufacture unanimity. And just take the concept of hardwiring, for example, which appears time and time again in contemporary UK policy literature. But as anyone with a popular interest in science would know, concepts of hardwiring are actually pretty anachronistic. Neuroplasticity is where it's at, with scientists hailing the lifelong capacity of the brain to adapt and change. And in UK policy circles at the moment, there is next to no attempt to explain this contradiction. So the claim that 2 is too late rests on an appalling but a highly strategic misrepresentation of the science. It legitimises a narrowing down of public services to focus exclusively on the mothering practices of poor families with young children. And that's exactly what we've been seeing over the last few years. Against a background of savage cuts to family services, we've seen the emergence of new professionals tasked with ensuring that disadvantaged mothers are bonding with their babies. So, no need to worry about soaring family homelessness or domestic violence services being cut by a third. A crack team of early intervention professionals are on call to make sure that mum demonstrates optimal sensitivity to her baby's needs. And I think the gendered implications really do need to be drawn out. Scratch the neuroscientific surface of early intervention and you'll find old and highly contentious tenets of attachment theory. The idea that individual development and psychological health is determined by the strength of the mother-infant bond dates back to the 1950s. It essentialises and naturalises motherhood as part of a valorisation of traditional family values. And it presents a culturally imperialist view, implicitly pathologising societies where shared infant care is the norm. But the most blatant role of neuroscience in policy at the moment is to deny the impact of structural inequality. The focus on the susceptibility of infant brains supports a portrayal of disadvantaged populations as the authors of their own misfortunes. Better parenting, we are told, is the key to social mobility. If poor young brains receive better nurturing, they will then be able to think themselves out of their predicament. So in essence then, really what we're being led to believe is that the rich and privileged just have better developed brains. And this message is sweetened by the promise that we could all compete on a level playing field if only our mothers had performed optimally. This biologisation of poverty is particularly insidious when you consider the extent to which the poor are currently being vilified, particularly those in receipt of welfare benefits. And let's be clear about how early years policy and practice is depicting the brains of those at the bottom of society as underdeveloped, and you can see that in your handouts. The iconic image of the two brains on there, the healthy versus shrunken, quite graphically conveys this idea. It accompanies a proliferation of claims that the poor have something missing from their brains, that they don't experience normal emotions, and, most powerfully, that they don't love their children like we do. In the media, we have seen a mass reproduction of hateful scrounger stereotypes, the stoking of public concern over rampant breeding and the burden on society. And when you throw in the biological determinism associated with current misappropriations of brain science, you've got an othering of the poor last seen in the heyday of the eugenics movement. And while sterilisation campaigns might be off the agenda, we are instead seeing a significant spike in the numbers of children being taken into care and adopted. And this has been attributed by the director of the Association of Children's Services, no less, to, I quote, a better understanding of the physical damage to brain development associated with poor parenting. In the 1930s, eugenic ideals were regarded by many sections of society, and especially, I might add, the liberal left, as progressive and enlightened. Early intervention, I think, occupies a similar mantle, with the disturbing political and practical implications obscured by the false promise of a better future. And I think this parallel highlights the urgent need to burst this feel-good early intervention bubble and to reclaim our own and our children's brains.
Thanks, Val. Jan asked me to address two questions. One, can neuroscience help us raise children? And the other was, why do people think it can? Or at least why does the UK policymakers think it can? So let me start with an answer, which you can already see, I think, where we're all going here. Can neuroscience help us raise children? Educate, nurture, interact with them, shape their environment and exposure? Can neuroscience help us do these things, which are elements of raising children? The answer, at least as of now, and we really have to add that caveat, I suppose, when you talk about anything that neuroscience can and can't do, but as of now, it certainly cannot. I say that because, very simply, there's little to no evidence that findings of brain function can be brought to bear on improving those activities, again, at this time. Whether they should be brought to bear is a different question, and I might be, I don't know, I might be more open than maybe to Val to such a thing, but we're not even ready for that question yet. Before you talk about the wisdom of applying a technology to a problem, you need persuasive evidence that it can do what it claims to do in the service of repairing that problem, or actually not only do it, but do it more cheaply and more efficiently than known interventions can. And we certainly can't say that for neuroscience at this time. So in my few minutes here, I want to do a few things. One is I want to look at the major questionable assumption behind the concept of brain-based child rearing, namely that brain-derived data should be privileged over psychological, behavioral, or social in early childhood years. The second is that this, what I call neurocentric approach, is a distraction to more productive areas of intervention and young children and their families. And third, to talk a bit about the risk of politicizing neuroscience, which actually Val touched on very eloquently. And then end with why I think that neuroscience-directed policy or practice seems appealing, actually seems incredibly appealing. And this would be a perfect example of mindless neuroscience. I really should have had a chapter on this in the book, but anyway, so why is a focus on the brain problematic? Because, obviously enough, there's more than neurobiology at stake. Now, it's trivially true that absolutely everything we learn, everything we feel, everything we do is ultimately mediated through the brain. So if you want to talk about brain-based, frankly, brain-based living, of course we do that right now because it's redundant many times to even invoke the brain. If there's behavior, there's going to be neural correlates of activity that are associated with the behavior, the perception, the cognition. So that's sometimes that's what we call, my colleague and I call neuroredundancy. But raising any a kid is certainly more than neurobiology. Development is so staggeringly complicated as a product of genes, environment, and context. And there's no way a one-size-fits-all kind of agenda could ever work. Let's put aside the fact that I'm not even sure what their agenda really is, and maybe we can talk about that later. It seems so vague and hand-wavy. But one presumption implicit in so much of this human development is that children's brains are similarly affected by developmental experiences, be those experiences family poverty, parental warmth, parental hostility, or the quality of child care. Well, all kids' brains don't respond the same. All kids don't respond the same. And one particularly interesting dimension of that, there are probably a lot of data one could marshal in the service of that statement, but one that's been getting a lot of attention lately in the developmental literature is, it goes by the name of the orchid dandelion hypothesis, which is to say that one child could be especially vulnerable to chaotic or somehow deficient childhood environments, and as opposed to a brother who is more resilient. But that same child who is more reactive and has a pronounced negative reaction to bad parenting, let's say, or problematic parenting, problematic early household, might have an exceptionally flourishing response to one that is, frankly, probably normal or perhaps even hyper-enriched. And that's what they mean. That's what's meant by orchid and dandelion. That you get really probably the worst kind of weed if the environment is bad, but if the environment is good, that particular child does even better than expected. And some genetic, there's been some genetic research done on serotonin transporters and the gene variants that may predict what kind, if your child is the orchid variety, meaning that it will do especially well in a warm hothouse environment, and particularly poorly in a deprived one. That's important to know. That's the kind of phenomenon that, again, a one-size-fits-all or a brain-based kind of approach is not particularly suited to. In fact, also, why do some kids, this was interested me in my work in PTSD, why do some people have a traumatic childhood and go on to then have a lower threshold for responding to subsequent traumatic episodes by developing post-traumatic stress disorder, while other people have, all things being equal as much as they can be, have the same exposures, but then go on to virtually be inoculated by those early experiences, so that when they encounter a traumatic or catastrophic situation later in life, do not develop PTSD. So why is it a risk factor in some, but a protective factor in others? I mean, that's a great question. I don't know the answer. I think it's that kind of work is underway. But again, it points to the fact that brains respond differently. Politicization, well, to the service of time, I think Val summarized that beautifully, a way of recasting value issues as medical and scientific ones. I'm going to skip, I have a great example of that, but I'll save that for Q&A. And I'm going to get to the part now about why, about how neuroscience seems to breathe new life into many old debates. And that would be fine, again, if the neuroscience data gave us some actionable insight, something with practical applications, and something either not redundant with what we already know or superior to what we can already derive through established means. But so why is this so compelling? Well, you know, as you probably heard, I forgot whose paper it was. That's the word seductive comes up a lot in neuroscience papers. So using it in my subtitle was almost a little bit of a parody / homage to this notion that brain scans in particular are incredibly, well, they're really quite fascinating, and certainly the technology behind them is breathtaking. But what they seem to do, I think brain images are actually the reason why neuroscience has gotten such a strong purchase on the public imagination and in this policy realm. And partly because, of course, it's visual, but it's really a confluence of four things, and I'll say those and then wrap up. One is that it's powerfully visual. We can talk later about how these scans aren't quite the kind of portraits of the brain in action as they're often portrayed. It's not that easy to infer cognitions from these dazzling brain scans. But anyway, the visual is extremely, extremely arresting. Then you've got the high-tech aspect, which is also bright and shiny, and politicians like that, and the promise of objectivity. Then you've got the brain, which is undeniably the most amazing organ in the body, and the most, probably the most complex system in the entire, frankly, universe. And then you have, fourth, wrapping it up, a very kind of a tidy brain to behavior narrative. You know, if we see this light up, then this is going to happen. And there's it creates the illusion of of innateness and immutability. In other words, you were born with this is the way the behavior is, and it can't change. Well, as you mentioned with plasticity, that's certainly not true at all. And finally, adding to this perfect storm is the fact that there's a lot of money to be made by pushing the idea of, for example, there's a big brain-based learning industry. That's largely a neurofad. So to sum up, we have desperation for, desperate for, politicians are desperate for solutions. And one problem, of course, is is the kind of problems we see with young people, and as they're maturing into adolescence, the crime and the problems that attend that. So that's a big problem that politicians very much want to answer. There is an incredible novelty in the application of neuroscience. There's enough poor science literacy to go around to make this seem very, very appealing when it really doesn't say very much. And there's a lot of profiteering. So that's a fairly lethal combination, I think, to make this something that's attractive, but largely a distraction from what we should be focusing on.
Great, thank you, Sally. Nancy?
Well, Jan asked me to look at some of the implications for parents, and I want to do that by looking at child policy in the U.S. But before I do that, I just want to make three assertions that we can argue about later. The one is, I'm going to go one better on Sally. I'm going to say that neuroscience has absolutely nothing to tell us about raising kids, and genetics doesn't either. And for the simple reason that parenting children is not a process, it's a relationship. But unfortunately, that is the way that we've come to look at raising kids. It's not about the parent-child relationship, it's about a process that you go through. The other thing I want to assert is that the problem of social progress, which is what child policy really addresses, it's trying to solve the problem of poverty or to ameliorate poverty, is not a technical matter of inputs and outputs, but a political problem, and certainly not a problem that we can lay on the shoulders of parents and of young children. It's just entirely inappropriate and it won't work. And then the final assertion is that if we allow the discussion to continue in the way that it has been framed, it's actually going to make things much harder for parents, and it's going to make the problems that these initiatives are trying to solve worse in the long run as well. The reason I want to talk about policy is that whenever an idea informs policy, it becomes normalized and internalized. And I think that that's really what has happened with neuroscience, is that in the United States since about the mid-90s, early childhood policy has been really based on principles of neuroscience, or the supposedly principles of neuroscience, but in fact they have nothing to do with neuroscience. And the problem is that when things become policy, people quite reasonably assume that the ideas behind them must be true. And so once you start considering the brain as a part of policy, it seems to kind of seep into everything. So not only do we think about, is this toy fun? We think about, what will this toy do to the brain? What will what kind of lessons should we have? What will engage kids? But it doesn't stop with that. It's now, what will these lessons do to kids' brains? And so I think that has, particularly in the U.S., is really just part of the furniture at this point. Public policy in the U.S. is also important because the think tanks, the child advocates, and the academic policy shops in the U.S. are the single most important source for the scientized view of child development in the world today. And particularly, I want to call out the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, which asserts a huge influence over these discussions. You'll find it footnoted over and over again in UK policy documents, not only in the Western world, but it's now also being incorporated into discussions about the developing world. And they've done this because what they have done is, under the auspices supposedly of Harvard University, they've aggregated scientific research from lots of different areas, from psychology, from genetics, from neuroscience, and they have done what no self-respecting scientist would ever do, which is to draw wild conclusions about what this means for child development. And they've actually taken these ideas and they have crafted a framework, a very technical, narrow framework for looking at the way the kids develop. And when I say crafted, I mean they actually have, they've actually put together a whole language. Serve and return is one of the terms that you hear over and over again. If you read through the literature, you'll come across phrases that are used over and over again. And in fact, those phrases were developed in focus groups with a nonprofit called the Frameworks Institute, which looks at the most effective ways to get these ideas across to people. And finally, I think that that policy in the U.S. is important because, like I said before, these policies, preschool policies, parenting intervention programs have been in place in the U.S. since the mid-90s. And so we know something about whether these things are effective or not. We know something about how these things work in practice, and we can actually see the sort of impact that they're having on parents and policymakers and the problems that they're supposed to address. In the terrible, terrible document, Parenting Matters, which if you did any of the reading beforehand, it's a British policy document, I found this quote that said, "We want parenting advice to be considered the norm, not just as many new parents choose to access antenatal education." And right now in the United States, I would argue that is the situation that exists right now. The idea that parents need help is very much kind of internalized by people. And the impact of this is that people really do take on board the idea that everything that they do will have an impact on their children's brains, and they're very willing, very open to the idea that they need special expertise to make sure that they don't do something that's going to mess up their kid's brain, which of course is great for advocates who want to see a certain type of parenting, because it just, I think the phrase that I've heard used is instant compliance. You know, you just say, well, you're hurting your child's brain, and parents sit up and think, oh, well, I better not do that now. And so what can we learn from the experience in the U.S.? And it's very interesting because up until now, most early childhood programs have been focused on kids and trying to make their experience with their parents less relevant. The idea is that you try and get kids into an environment for large periods of time that is different from their home environment. That's more like a middle-class home where they have access to language and to enriching experiences that they wouldn't experience at home. But more recently, there's been a bit more talk in policy circles about the need to intervene at home with more initiatives that are actually targeted specifically at parents. And not just in the early childhood years, but actually throughout childhood. But it's very interesting because if you read American literature, it's much less enthusiastic about parenting interventions than the UK literature is. So a recent report from the Brookings Institute described the impact of parenting interventions as modest but meaningful. And the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard says that science shows that there are opportunities through development to provide children, adolescents, and the adults who care for them with the relationships, environments, and skill-building activities that will enhance their executive function capacities. That's the brain. It's just easier, less costly, and more effective to get them right from the start. And I think the reason for this is that the experience of the last 30 years is that even though you can show correlations between things that parents do in a middle-class home and their kids' success later on, simply trying to get poor parents to mimic that activity doesn't work. And of course, I hope all of us in this room understand why it doesn't work, because it's not about the behavior, but it's about something more. But nevertheless, there's now a willingness to think about doing more of these interventions. And I think the interesting twist on this is that it's not advocates who are that enthusiastic about it. In fact, I think it's actually more coming from parents, because having accepted that you need special expertise to raise kids, it almost creates its own demand. And it's not just with poor families. And I want to give you an example from Park Slope Parents, which is like madly affluent, crazed, group of parents, very, very privileged and stuff. But what's really interesting is that I've been working with them for almost a decade, and in the beginning, you notice that parents would read lots of books, and then they would kind of organize themselves into groups around a philosophy of parenting. So you had all the attachment parentings people and the baby wearers hanging out together, and then you had certain other groups hanging out together and supporting one another. But what's happened over the last sort of 2-3 years is that that's not enough, because it's not specific enough for your kids. And so there's this boom in what they call parenting coaches. And so parenting coaches are people who you can sit down and consult with about the specific problems that you're having in raising your child. And it's not just early childhood, it goes on, it goes on and on and on. And so it's kind of like when you know that expertise is in the picture, you're constantly kind of open to that, and maybe even seeking it out. And so I think what's happened is that pragmatically it may be that advocates don't think that that these things work particularly well, but they've kind of created a situation where they have to go to that when they have nowhere else to go. The other thing that is, and the last thing I'll say that's interesting is, do I have time?
Oh, very quick.
All right. Well, the last thing is that the other reason why advocates are starting to look at these interventions is that having adopted these brain-based childhood education programs for the last 30 years, what they're finding is that they don't work, that they've made absolutely no impact on social mobility. And in some cases, in Georgia, which has a gold standard preschool program, the gap between black and white students has actually gotten bigger. So they have to have something, and so there's a kind of desperation, well, maybe if we do a few more parenting interventions, it will help us to sustain the gains that we made.
Thank you, Nancy. I think I'm actually going to straight away go out to the floor, actually. Yeah, good. Hands are up.
I thought Val was extremely, negative about the whole thing at the beginning, and it seemed you've got a political agenda. In other words, government and other bodies have identified a great problem in bringing up children. They've got a problem when these kids go into school. They've got a problem with dysfunctional families. And we've seen manifestation of the problem in these kids who've been killed by their own parents. So government has to try and do something about it. Now, I don't agree necessarily with neuroscience. I think it's a very mechanistic view. But I think to take the view that it's government doing this, they're conservatives, it's an attack upon the poor, confuses this whole idea that poverty is associated with bad behaviour, bad bringing up. It's not. We loathe the idea of what the Victorians called the deserving and the undeserving poor, and this is out of fashion. In fact, it had a lot of merit, because it would actually distinguish that you could be poor, but you could have moral values, you could believe in bringing up your children with very little money, and there were other people who simply were dysfunctional. They didn't bring their children up, they were utterly feckless, and today's equivalent of drink, there's plenty of drink, is probably drugs and dysfunctional families. Now, she mentioned eugenics, and in fact the eugenics movement in the 1930s arose from people like Huxley, the two Huxleys, and Mary Stopes. And that came very much out of the First World War. A lot of people, a lot of the working classes, were actually medically examined for the first time in the army. And they found there were an awful lot of people of very poor health and also not greater mental ability. Equally, the officer class had actually been killed off, and there was actually a social worry amongst administrators on how the country was going to be run. So that's where it came from, and it was utterly corrupted by Hitler, where he looked for a master race, and that was appalling. But I think one does need to distinguish that there is a problem, and one needs to deal with it, and it can be done. I think what Nancy said was quite right. It is neuroscience doesn't solve parenting. It's actual parenting, love, concern, dealing with your children, and talking to them from the earliest age.
Obviously, the neuroscience has been misused, but don't blame neuroscience. Obviously, you need convergent lines of evidence across disciplines. So it's the people, particularly the politicians, misusing it. I think everything else the panel said about both parenting and gene environment factors are seriously awry. I'll briefly explain why both those are the case. The really seminal sort of sea change book about all this was The Nurture Assumption by Judith Rich-Harris, published in 1999. She was a developmental psychologist of decades standing. And she pointed out, at the conclusion of all the research, is that to be a good mother, you need to be just good enough. It's very rare you find a mother that's actually so bad that it's going to have a serious negative impact on the long-term outcome of development of a child. And she pointed out that the main focus of socialisation is not the family at all. It's from a very, very young age, the peer group. But peer group socialisation throughout the world is exactly the same, and it's not about culture. It's essentially, basically, about biology. I mean, what happens is from toddler age onwards, the sexes self-segregate, boys with boys, girls with girls, and it's what you bring individually to the party, as it were, with genes, and that determines what status you have in the male group and where you are in the personal network in the female group, basically what mate value you have, which obviously is crucial for later life and reproduction. That's what it's all about. So to characterise it as you've done in terms of parenting styles, and to talk as you do about gene-environment interaction, it's completely wrong. There's a general problem with trying to get your head around biology and culture. Culture is not something separate. Culture never goes off at a strange tangent from biology. It's a manifestation of evolved social psychology, and it evolved in the first place to function, to feedback, to fine-tune, and to reinforce the underlying biology. It's not a separate thing, and people, particularly on the left, do not understand this.
I think it would be good to address that question directly. So who would like to talk about Judith Rich-Harris and alternative meanings of environment, perhaps?
Well, I mean, I think I would make a distinction between science as a tool for understanding development and how we interact with our kids. I think what Judith Rich-Harris says is that about 50% of personality traits are genetic. She says you can reproduce that. And then she suggests that that after that, the influence of peer groups take over. And if you read her second book, No Two Alike, she goes into that a bit more, and she has her own theory of socialization. But I think that, I do think that culture does matter. And I think that the problem is not biology, it's not science, but it's more like a moral collapse, because it seems to me that we're now looking to science to give us the answers to questions which are essentially just we have to use our own judgment, and we don't trust it anymore.
So just to you were suggesting earlier, Sally, that it's a question of not yet, but maybe at some point neuroscience can give us these kinds of answers. But Nancy, you're saying not ever.
Well, I was being a little, but
yeah, you're saying they're separate domains.
I'm just open to the idea. I have a hard time imagining what it could look like. Except for, what I can imagine, maybe let's talk about what I can imagine. And this is pretty narrow, but you have to be specific when you're talking about applications of technology. And for example, Sally and Ben Shaywitz are professors at Yale, and they're very interested in, among other things, in reading problems. So they're doing brain scans of kids prior to the age at time at which they'd be taught reading, but to get as clear a sense as they can about the neural structures that children, that mediate reading and, the processing of written language, and can make a distinction between children whose essentially equipment is intact, but are already starting to have problems in reading, versus children who have, I'm being very, very, very abbreviated here, but who have, where the actual neural substrate is defective, and that these children would need different kinds of help in becoming better learners, for example. And they're hoping that they can see these difference in neural signatures even before, at the earliest age possible, so they can use different learning strategies. That kind of thing looks promising to me. But I don't see, one thing you mentioned is sort of don't blame neuroscience. I don't hear anybody blaming neuroscience at all. It's wildly overinterpreted. I'm sure are you a neuroscientist? Oh, okay. Which you would concede if you were. I mean, in fact, almost all the data I got for the book was based, that I elaborated upon, but was ultimately based on neuroscientists' own frustration with the overinterpretation and that kind of license of their work. And lastly, yes, I agree also with this. My impression was a non-shared environment that siblings experience is highly formative for them as well. So,
Val, do you want to come back on
just very briefly, I mean, I totally agree with Nancy, but I think you can argue about the politics forever, but that's the point. Science is you're never able really to properly separate it from the politics, and you shouldn't be able to really either. It's it's not a pure form of knowledge. That's how it's being presented at the moment. It's being presented in that way to try and close down debate. So I think, yeah, let's talk about the politics, but let's not mask it in this kind of discourse of science.
Thank you. Right, okay. Yes?
I thought Nancy's comment on the way this works in the States was interesting, and I wouldn't mind pursuing that a little bit more. I mean, what seems to happen here is that in the face of the failure of any of these efforts to change society by changing the way people raise their kids, the failure of those to make any difference to anything really, has led to a situation where what you do is to say, well, we just have to start even earlier. So the trajectory here, for example, recognising that Sure Start didn't work, it didn't really make a difference to anything, is to come up with 2 is too late. So what you do is simply project the problem to an earlier and earlier stage of development, and now right back into fetal development and even pre-pregnancy. And I think that process in itself is one that's worth looking at in terms of differences between the States and Britain, and also in terms of its consequences for this really kind of profound level of intervention in the very early stages of the journey into becoming a parent. I suppose overall the conclusion that I draw from the state of the discussion at the moment is just the really fundamental level of bankruptcy within the political class and within efforts to understand anything about society, how it works, and attempts to get to grips with social problems. So what you basically have is, as far as I can see, a pretty dispiriting flip-flop between 2 equally vile versions of deterministic thinking. Genetic determinism on the one hand, I mean, obviously we've seen that in the last week in comments that have been made about how kids do at school being decided by their genes. So you've now got this very strong view within the political class that, well, you just write them off, really. So there's this sort of whole load of kids that you really can't ever do anything with anyway. Between that and its alternative, which is that you can nurture nature, but only by basically destroying the privacy of the family. So the version of determinism that you're talking about, parental determinism, doesn't say, well, the way you're born is the way you're going to end up. It says we can modify it, but only if we essentially override the family as early as possible. And it seems to me that that's really all that exists now in terms of thinking. And I think it does pose, it does pose some very, very serious challenges for us because, there will never be anything vaguely resembling a better society coming out of either of these ways of thinking. But what they both do, I think, is to engender really profound levels of fatalism and difficulty in the way people think about tomorrow. So we have got a serious task in confronting all of this, I think.
This is called the Battle of Ideas, and free speech is allowed. And I'd just like you to explain, this is more like a gathering to formulate a document against the government's current policy. I don't see much of a debate here. And everyone's talked about a bogeyman, and we don't have the bogeyman here. Don't a lot of people feel that it would be interesting to hear the bogeyman? So I'm sure they've got slightly better arguments than they're being allocated at the moment.
Well, just to explain why I selected the panel that I did, and it was because having researched this the last year, myself and Val, and we've been engaged in this area, and actually it's very, very difficult to find neuroscientists who will associate themselves with policy or who actually see themselves have anything to do with this. And secondly, to find policy advocates who are able to coherently express these views. And while you can find the articulation of them in the reports, which is what we've been ploughing through, and Val's also been interviewing advocates, it's actually quite difficult to find the evangelists who are willing to speak in this way. So there are a few, Graham Allen MP, Iain Duncan Smith, etc. There's a few people, the Wave Trust. But actually, the problem is I didn't want they'd be leapt on, so I didn't really want to set them up. So I thought, actually, I was hoping that from the audience we'd have people's, a very diverse range of opinions that will hold the panel to account, which I hopefully, we're quite happy to do, and I think they're more than happy to do.
I'm a member of the so-called political class, having been an MP and an MSP, and none of us call ourselves the political class. We're all very different. Usually our best friends are among the opposition and across the board. I mean, basically, when we're looking after a constituency, and we're not writing academic reports or doing PhDs, but when we're in a constituency and dealing with sink estates, quite frankly, we're firefighting. And just to give you a very brief example, I had a sink estate in one of my towns. I went to my local chief executive of my borough council, who's superb, absolutely superb, first rate. Not all of them were, but he was. And I said, look, the family are in this estate. It's being renovated round them. You're not removing them out while it's being renovated. He said, we daren't. He said, we can't put them in another estate because they're afraid that then the other estate will deteriorate. We've got to leave them there. I spoke to the local GP. He said half their mothers are on Valium. It basically, these are environmental factors. We're at the sharp end. We're firefighters. It's bloody hell. You're just trying to put a fire out, I tell you. And, you do your best. And I was really worried, because I was worried about these kids cramped into these houses, renovation going on, trouble within the families, the behavioural problems, the problem families. I mean, it is an extreme example, but that's the kind of thing that the political class, what we don't call ourselves that, have to deal with. We just have to deal with a very rough, sharp end.
One thing you won't be able to firefight with is an early intervention scheme, however early you start. I think actually you could have got a child psychologist or a pediatrician on the panel to give you the nuanced and mediated justification for early intervention. I was at a conference on vulnerability. I'm a pediatrician, a community pediatrician, and I was at a conference last week on vulnerability, and it was an absolute article of faith that early intervention was crucial for the development of children and for counteracting the effects of vulnerability in families. Absolute article of faith. And believe you me, I was a real pariah when I stood up and said, well, in the first place, all the examples you use of damage to children, you still go back to the Romanian orphanages and you still use these very extreme examples of deprivation and maltreatment in order to then try and link it with neurobiology, which is the crucial thing. And of course, You can go back even earlier in the States to the 1950s, where they were trialing some of these early intervention policies, and none of them worked. Of course, they couldn't work in dealing with social problems. But I think the thing to grasp is that neurobiology, and I think the panel have made the point quite well, neuroscience is really the new form of looking at, the justifying, if you like, early intervention. Previously it was the theories of, cycles of deprivation and things like that, more sociological explanations. But these neuroscience explanations, just as Sally argued, are very, very attractive, because it seems to marry medicine, child development, and parenting very, very, very nicely. And it's absolutely true that neuroscientists are at pains to say, don't over-interpret our results. We're in an infancy as far as, brain science is concerned. So they're trying to distance themselves from some of the conclusions. But I think the point, just to conclude, is there are lots of people in society mediating these arguments. So you don't only have to challenge at the level of policy, you do have to challenge at the level, of child development and medicine and those layers who are actually mediating these new arguments.
I live a few hundred miles south of Nancy in Washington, D.C., and I came to this session knowing a little bit about neuroscience, but having had my kids for a collective 20 years, I'm shuddered to think, in Washington, D.C. public schools, it was not something that I had come across at all. And I then started thinking about it, and if you look at some things that the DC public schools have done recently, DC public schools have got a really bad reputation as regards providing a quality education. There are spots of excellence, but most of it's very, very poor. And often that's a result of mainly very poor children and families sending their kids to those schools. And they've tried dozens of different interventions. And the thing that they've started doing recently, because none of them have worked, is they have floated the idea of having year-round schooling, even for kids who are in Head Start, which starts, I think, at 2.5 or 3 years old. And it's a way of taking kids out of the environment where their parents are, because their parents are not able to provide for them. And they're providing meals, 3 meals a day now, and kids as young as 2.5 and 3 years old in some areas of the city are taken out of their parents' realm for the whole day. And because basically they're desperate to try something, they have not been able to find anything that has improved test scores or has made any significant impact, which may or may not go to prove the point that neuroscience doesn't work, but it really does show that they have no idea what does work.
I don't have a problem that we haven't got somebody talking neuro-BS or whatever you want to call it on the panel, because I hear it and come across it a lot, and I want to hear a different story. I mean, these days it would seem that, and I thought a battle is not just a battle of ideas in the room, it's the battle of ideas in the world that we want to be able to address and think about. So that's quite important for me. But I wanted to ask, first of all, I don't recognise this problem that everyone's talking about. And I don't think I live in a sort of nice bubble. I live in the heart of the East End and work with lots and lots of young people. But I don't see there's no rash of feral children running about. I don't see that there's all these evil, bad, dysfunctional parents and families. So I would say, first of all, we've got to ask this basic question, what is this problem that we're talking about? Then I'd like to know, is it the sort of tail wags the dog? How did it happen here in terms of parenting being so fixated upon, so maligned, and then is it policymakers making that their baby in the absence of real vision or whatever, the overhyping of a problem? Does neuroscience then get in on the act, or is neuroscience being mobilised behind the act? Because from what you're saying, there's a lot of neuroscientists who don't like the way they've been used, but on the other hand, you don't see a lot of neuroscientists getting out there saying, just cut this out. They're not standing up to the crap, which I would have thought might be necessary. And secondly, is there the chance that, given a lot of this does sound like BS completely to me, and a fictitious focus too, quite dangerous and so intrusive in people's lives, is there the opportunity to muster neuroscience to prove that this is nonsense, actually, because these things aren't demonstrated?
My co-author and I took so many pains to discuss the great promise and the already realized promise of neuroscience. I happen to, my interest is more clinical, but on the basic science level, of understanding the mechanisms. I mean, basically, neuroscience is about the brain, which is about mechanism, and our concern, and that will and has done wonderful things. I hope it all keeps us out of nursing homes for dementia. But we also wanted to make a claim that we shouldn't lose the mind in the age of brain science, because the mind is about awareness and meaning. And one of the reactions to the book, there was a strain of kind of hostility from a neuroscientist who said, that's where I pricked up when you mentioned some sort of like maybe we were blaming neuroscience, gosh, there was neuroscience bashing going on and a neuroscience backlash. And I thought, you know, that we were so sensitive to, again, extolling the technology and this mode of inquiry for its proper purposes. And I don't mean proper in a political way, I mean proper in a scientific way. What are the scientific questions that are amenable to being addressed through this modality? So, what's my point? My point is that I was surprised at the defensiveness on the one hand. So that's one point. You also mentioned, Jan, that a lot of neuroscientists, you know, they're in the lab and they're trying to get grants and they don't want to have anything to do with this. And most are somewhat mortified at the extent to which it's been popularized and distorted. But the few who are not mortified are the ones who rush to the microphones and you know, sometimes if you look at their work very carefully, you just get the feeling that their colleagues probably wouldn't say they're the creme de la creme of their, but they get, you know, they can leverage their status and get enormous outsized attention. So even though they talk about science literacy, there's a new profession, if you will, or a discipline called neuroethics, which would take on just this kind of situation. As, you know, what do we do when the media overplay our findings? A lot of them spend a lot of time talking with the journalists to make sure they understand it, and some perhaps less so. But that's something for what it's worth, that's something that they're aware of. But it's difficult because some don't want to be involved at all, and sometimes the ones that do are. It's big to get your name in the newspaper. Like there was this, it's a ridiculous study, but I could not believe it was all over the news, in the US anyway, about rats and cocaine and Oreo cookies. I don't know if you saw that. I mean, not to go on, but I will say the first part of this that was bizarre is there's no refereed paper available to read. That hasn't been published. So that, in and of itself, as a process matter, is bizarre. But it was a very poorly done study, and you just want it. So I don't see, I mean, I would have spoken out about the flaws in that study and the conclusions that were drawn. But it's hard, and there are a group of AAAS and all the science organizations that always comes up at their annual meetings. How do we interact with the media? And I think they're becoming more and more sensitized, but it's always a tension.
Yeah, from what you've been doing, Val, I mean, what do you think about why this works its way through into policy in the first place?
Yeah.
Which way are things going?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what's really interesting is that, well, maybe we need to think about the very particular political context here, because I think it's quite different, or has been in the States, the way it was originally kind of taken up as a kind of PR vehicle to argue for funding for early years services in a context where there was very little early years services. But we almost seem to have the mirror opposite here, where, you know, we did have early years services, and neuroscience is being used now to argue for a narrowing right down and for cuts, you know, to target services towards the very, very poorest and to narrow down to very particular services. So, you know, whereas we had Sure Start that was providing universal services like, you know, subsidised childcare, toy libraries, mother-baby groups, they're closing at a rate of knots. And what they are being replaced with is family nurses that go out into the homes of the most deprived pregnant women and then kind of monitor and regulate how they seem to be bonding with their unborn babies. So I think there's something, you know, very particular.
Val and I have been on a circuit where we've been to various academic conferences, but you've got some really lovely examples of what these family nurse partnerships, family nurses are actually doing. So how do they instruct the mothers in the neuro way of doing things? Because people may not know this stuff.
Yes, well, they are. They're quite evangelical about neuroscience. They are taught, not terribly thoroughly, obviously, about the importance of neuroscience. They take out a little sheet on the very first visit to the mother called How to Build Your Baby's Brain. And it has a list of activities, and they're very basic activities like read to your baby, sing nursery rhymes to your baby. That is how you build the baby's brain. And then they have a whole load of quite creative ways of kind of instilling this information and conveying to the mother how important it is that they follow exactly what they're told. So, for instance, they'll do, one of them draws pictures of the brains, so a little brain and a larger brain, and says, you know, that's what will happen if you don't listen to what I say. Another one takes Alka-Seltzer tablets along and asks for a glass of water and drops the Alka-Seltzer tablets in and says, every time you do these activities, that's your child's synapses forming. There are all kinds of various different things, activities with pipe cleaners, so it's very specifically focused on that. The interesting thing, I think someone asked about, you know, why neuroscientists weren't kind of speaking out more about this. There are an enormous number of really good critical neuroscientists out there. But there is a real silence around early intervention, and I have been surprised, but I think partly it's because it still has this progressive veneer attached to it, and the sense that if you speak out against early intervention, you are perhaps jeopardising one of the only sources of funding that there is for disadvantaged families, and, you know, I think that's wrong.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because, I mean, I have mixed feelings because, in fact, I think preschool is fantastic. I mean, it's great for parents to be able to have a place to take their kids, and I actually think it's great for kids. But the reason why I think it's great for kids is that I think education is great for kids. I think that education is a gift we give our kids, and as far as I'm concerned, it's never too early to do it. And I think part of the problem is that education, and particularly early childhood education, is not really about education. It's about social engineering, and I think in the States this happens fairly early on. I mean, I guess I mean, it struck me that when I first started researching this, I kept trying to find information about Head Start in the Department of Education, and it's not in there. It's actually in it's somewhere else with social services, and I think what it shows is that, you know, right from the very beginning, although there's a certain group of people who and I would count myself as one of them, who think that education for its own sake is a fantastic thing, there are a lot of people who are trying to solve social problems with this, and I guess the striking thing to me is that in the States, this actually goes back to the war on poverty in the 60s, but it's just become so much narrower now and so much more pessimistic. So, you know, one of the original reasons why Head Start was kind of championed was that it was easy to get sympathy for kids as opposed to adults. And so that was part of a program that, in fact, was very ambitious. They wanted to eradicate poverty. And the discussion now, the expectations are so much lower. I mean, social mobility is not about eradicating policy. It's about finding a few individuals who can rise up the ladder, who can get out of poverty. So it's already much more pessimistic, and is just about having much lower expectations. And I think I just want to make a slightly separate point, is that I do think there are real social problems that need to be addressed. I think that we need to talk about what has happened to the institution of the family, how it's not a unit now that is more than the sum of its parts. It's actually a collection of individuals who all have individual needs, which are usually competing needs. And in the States, and I'd be interested to hear how this compares to over here, is you really do have a problem with there not being a stable way to raise kids. So that, in people under 30 now, 40% of births are out of wedlock. And it's not because people are cohabitating, or they aren't cohabitating, and they're just kind of off, having babies on their own. They are cohabitating, but they don't think it's worth marrying the person they've had the child with, because their expectations are so low. Their expectations of being able to have a committed relationship. And so, marriage and the family are not what they were. They're not able to serve the purpose that they were. And I think a discussion of that would be much more fruitful than trying to solve these problems, at the level of neurons and synapses.
It seemed like you were asking for a very anecdotal response to whether it was familiar, and I really am very sympathetic, and the arguments you're making, particularly on that, are very resonant with me. But I never have, in my years of raising my twins, actually, I'm aware of use of science in other ways, but the neuroscience hasn't actually come into it. I did a parenting course at one point, and there didn't seem to be a lot of science. It just seemed to be about how to be nice to your children and have a better life. The healthy eating thing is a massive way that science is used to berate children, parents, pardon. And the bogeyman seems to be, just anecdotally, a more vague notion of emotional damage, which also that you'll damage your child. The cortisol levels, if you leave a child to cry, is often quoted. So this is, I read a lot of Mumsnet. I'm quite into all this stuff, and so I've never much come across the neuroscience. Doesn't seem to figure. My child has special educational needs. The diagnosis of autism seemed to involve very little neuroscience. He was never put in a tube or had any brain scan. They just asked him to fail to catch a ball, and it was based on quite sort of educated but pretty unsophisticated methods. But I do wonder, just in relation to the special needs, whether there is actually room for more neuroscience. There seems to be very little involved with raising my son, and it is quite a scientific process to deal with those issues. So although I'm very sympathetic to the less intervention, I think there's a case for different kind of neuroscience that I could have done with a lot more of it. Less pressure to breastfeed and more kind of some actual science going on would be good.
Interesting.
Yeah, I got invited to a series of 3 workshops at my son's school, which was about how to develop your child's learning muscle, and that was all based on neuroscience. Unfortunately, it was on a Tuesday when I was teaching, so I couldn't go. But they did summarise it, and so I read the summary, which is told us that what neuroscience has taught us about children's learning muscle, i.e. the brain, is we have to change the way they speak. So they shouldn't say, I'm good at maths, or I'm no good at maths, or I'm good at history, but I try hard at history, and that changes the learning muscle and the synapses of the brain. So it is just absolute rubbish. But I agree with the person at the front here in the sense of thinking about how much has it actually infiltrated public consciousness. You do get invited. Lots of parents went to that, and all the teachers at the school had to go to listen to that kind of rubbish 3 evenings in a row. I'm not convinced that it has really infiltrated public consciousness in that way. I think what has influenced public consciousness is this idea that what you do in pregnancy in the first 2 years is really important. And so I sort of been thinking about a comment you made, Val, which I don't know if it was off the cuff and whether you meant to say it, which was that neuroscience has replaced attachment theory. And maybe you didn't say that, but to me, attachment theory is like they evangelize about it within social services, and it's absolutely unquestioned. And to me, when they do use neuroscience, it's sort of to give credibility to it. So that idea is still there, and neuroscience is giving credibility to this.
I agree completely with what Nancy was saying earlier about how parents are becoming almost paralysed by their belief that they need experts to teach them how to raise their children. I was just wondering if you had any idea on how to break that vicious circle and get parents to have more confidence in their own abilities without worrying about the medical side of it or attachment theory, all these different theories that there are.
Yeah, I agreed broadly with some of the points the panel made about, the actual use of neuroscience. I often hear people say things like, oh, it's been proven that if you do this, then it actually changes your brain, which is kind of a meaningless thing to say, because I think you do change your brain. If you learn something new, you've changed your brain. But that's used as some kind of amazing evidence. But there seems to be this difference here between talking about neuroscience and talking about early intervention. And I think that I'm less sure about the arguments about early intervention and about the fact that there's no problem to solve that someone over here was talking about. It's known that children from poorer families have worse outcomes throughout their life. They are in the lower performance tier when they first arrive at school. We know that's a fact, and if we want to change that and we want to have social mobility, then we have to find a way of doing that. And if they're already at that point by the time they get to school, then maybe we have to try stuff before school. School itself, of course, is an intervention. We've been doing it a long time, but it's there. It's an intervention. It hasn't worked in terms of creating social mobility. It doesn't have the desired effect. So it seems logical to think, well, maybe let's try something earlier on. The fact that these things have been tried for a relatively short time period compared to school and haven't yet found to have the effect we want, maybe it's going to take longer, maybe it takes multiple generations for these things to sink in, to change behaviour in terms of parents changing their child's behaviour slightly, then they change their child's behaviour more. There could be various ways these interventions might work over time, and I think that kind of thing has to be taken into account rather than simply kind of rubbishing them and casting them aside. And they need to be considered as an approach to try to solve the issue of the fact that poor people are trapped in this cycle of low achievement, low attainment, rather than a sort of demonisation of the poor necessarily.
While having a bit of lefty sympathy for Val, I think she's also missing a trick a bit, because it's almost a presentation that there's a kind of rise of the right, whereas I just think it's a problem of the collapse of everything. Which is why I think the MP, MSP and people like him permanently feel like they're firefighting, because they have no mission. So because they can't see the wood, all they see are lots of trees, and they find lots of worms in those trees, because everything is a micro-obsession today. So because essentially what early intervention does, it says after 3 you're screwed. Right? Now if you were a strong moral conservative, you would believe that religion could transform people. If you were a liberal, you would think that the individual has the capacity to grow and develop. If you were a socialist, you would think we can transform these things. But you look at institutions, prisons don't believe prisons can rehabilitate people anymore. Cops don't really think they can do a job with crime. Most cops I know are in early intervention. And it's more that you've got a collapse of a belief in institutions. And the argument which came out in the 1970s, this idea that nothing works, which was to do with state planning, which is the huge difference from the late 19th century. Because at the end of the 19th century, there was a belief that massive planning at various levels could transform society. And that's what seems to have collapsed, any big ideas. So we become obsessed. So we end up with early intervention, which is one of the most degraded ideas about people, that essentially by the age of 3, you're screwed.
Well, I think expecting neuroscientists to critique neurobabble is the same error as expecting Muslim clerics to critique Islamism. You know, the one suggests that there is a connection to the other, whereas there is no connection between the way that neuroscience is misinterpreted and applied to social problems and real neuroscience. I think it's not neuroscience being misapplied and corrupting society, it's rather the other way around. There's a dystopian society that looks to the kind of narrow deterministic notions that neuroscience presents as a means of explanation. But the problem starts with society, and therefore it's all of our roles to be critiquing this misapplication rather than to look to neuroscientists who are not necessarily responsible for that.
Nancy made the point about marriage and family, and there are questions that maybe we need to look at, or problems that we might want to address in relation to that. But today, no one wants to discuss those as moral or political questions, and the kind of scientific discourse sounds very scientific and therefore unquestionable. And I think that is why it seems so attractive to politicians and people who maybe in the past would have addressed those questions in a more political or moral way. But I think on the other side of it, in terms of parents, I mean, I do think it does have an impact. I think there's been over and over again, over a number of years, we've had all these missives back from school, or you know, as soon as you become pregnant, and from the government telling us how to behave. And I think what happens when those things are posed in a more scientific way is that they become, again, something that it is more difficult for you as a parent to question, even though the consequence of it is very much, very clearly telling you how to behave in the very intimate relationship with your children. I mean, one question I had is that I don't think it's just early years where this kind of everything gets batted around as a scientific discussion rather than a political or moral. So one thing my son tells me, he's 12, he really can't wait, I think, to be a teenager because then teenagers' brains change, don't you know, Mummy? And I won't be able to get up in the morning, I won't be able to do this. And I think it kind of does filter through in all kinds of ways, in a sense, where the brain and how the brain behaves becomes a kind of excuse for our behaviour, as well as a way to tell us to behave in a particular way.
So, in reverse order, so if we go to Val.
Okay. Just to sort of clarify, whoever said about attachment theory, gosh, no, neuroscience isn't replacing attachment theory at all. It's embellishing it and giving it a renewed authority. So just to make that clear, the collapse of everything, I'd have more sympathy with that if this wasn't also repetitive. It just feels like it's over and over again. It's a cycle of deprivation cycle, really, and you can go right back, you know, past to the poor law, really, and there are similar kinds of arguments being made over and over again. And to bring it back to policy, I suppose, just by finishing off, I think that this whole take-up of neuroscience actually is part of quite a significant change in the way that we are now understanding social policy, because we seem to have moved away from a more sort of utilitarian focus on you know, benefits to the wider, broader population to quite a sort of narrow economic focus on like returns, economic returns, financial returns in the future. And that's, you know, with all this emphasis at the moment on what works in policy, and what works seems to have become a bit divorced from what, you know, whether actually people feel like they benefit from policy or not, and it's more about whether, you know, there's a saving made to the public purse. And child poverty, just to say, I think is a really, really good example of that, because politicians seem to have managed to reroute the debate right away from the moral and the ethical acceptability of children suffering real hardship in the here and now, and instead they are talking about the importance of equipping children somehow to be able to escape poverty when they're grown up. So I think that's quite significant. So I think, you know, we need more of a debate around what social policy actually should be for, and I don't think there's any real role for neuroscience in that.
Thank you. Sally?
Yeah, one thing that actually I think this is probably one of the major cultural projects facing us, which is that we're going to get much better at generating biological explanations of behavior. I mean, we're pretty good at it, and we're only going to be able to become more nuanced and test hypotheses better about mechanism. And that is going to have significant implications for how we understand moral agency, because there's, it seems to me, a fairly widespread confusion that if you have a mechanistic explanation of how the brain works, then you have a mechanistic explanation how a person works. And those two are not necessarily true at all. We'll skip the metaphysics of free will, but I'll just point out that what we're going to learn more about is the neural underpinnings of choice making, of self-control, of the things that we think of when we think of self-determination. So sometimes, when people get all excited about, oh, it's in the brain, it's in the brain. Are you a dualist? Where would it be? Of course it's in the brain. The question is it in the brain in such a way that you cannot reason, you cannot control your behavior, you can't plan for the future, you can't deliberate, you can't react to reason? That's what we care about. That's what the legal system cares about, and that's what everyday morality is. And again, without getting metaphysical into the free will problem, that's sort of good enough for most people. And looking at a brain, this may change, but to date, we can't look at a brain scan and tell whether a person who happens to be an addict, let's say, or some who engages in some bad habits, whether or not this person experienced an impulse that was irresistible versus an impulse that was not resisted. We can't know that from a brain scan. Actions speak louder than images most of the time, and some of that may change again in the future, but right now, it's very important to keep that distinction in mind between how important it is to think about mechanism, and that's what brain, I said this before, but mechanism is what the brain is about, and meaning and morality and values is what is the realm of our mind.
Thank you. Nancy.
I want to come back to, I think it was something Stuart said about the forest and the trees, because I really do feel like we've completely lost the forest. And I was thinking about this because I was wondering, why is it that not just in early childhood policy, but in almost all social policy, the discussion becomes incredibly narrow and technical, and almost dominated by economists at a certain point. And that certain point in the States is the mid-90s. And it's really interesting because it is like everything is really about the data. And it's just incredibly narrow and technical and scientized. And I got to thinking about it, and I can't help but think that there is a connection with the end of the Cold War. And with what Fukuyama said about history ending, because it's when our society is a given, then you can't really fundamentally tinker with it. You can't fundamentally change it anymore. All you can do is tinker with it. And I think that that's what we've got, is we don't have a big perspective. We just have a lot of increasingly deterministic tinkering. I think it's more obvious when you look at the developing world, where now, the World Bank is now a big supporter of early childhood education for social mobility. And so, you look at some place like Jamaica, and where early childhood education is being touted as this great thing, and you think, well, what is the problem in Jamaica? Is the problem in Jamaica that Jamaica doesn't have enough early childhood education? Is it parenting? Or is it that there needs to be more development in the third world, more development, or the developing world? Is it the lack of, a robust economy and a stable society that comes from that, which is the problem? And I really think that we need to broaden out the way that we look at these things, and not be afraid to try and pose these questions in social terms. And just one final point, which I think is ironic, is that in the States now, instead of there is a push to make things earlier and earlier and earlier, even into pregnancy. But what's interesting is that to justify parenting interventions, there's a discussion now of neuroplasticity. And so, hey, it lasts to 25. So we can still intervene. And what's so bizarre is that it's based on the same data. It's based on the same evidence. And to me, that says that it's not neuroscience that is generating policy. It's policy that is generating the discussion of neuroscience.
Fantastic. Can we thank our speakers?